Hello, my name is Mike King, and this is the first of a series of talks exploring enlightenment. I've been exploring enlightenment for 45 years after an experience in India that you could call an enlightenment experience. It left a mark on me and a direction to my life that has not changed, but in the intervening period I've explored countless other examples of enlightenment across the globe and across time, including peoples in the East where the language of enlightenment is relatively common, as in Buddhism and Hinduism, and in the West where that language is couched rather differently in terms of Christian mysticism or Jewish or Islamic mysticism, or amongst the Native Americans or other indigenous peoples where enlightenment nestles, as it were, in a framework of what we broadly call the nature religions, animism or shamanism. In this introductory talk, I will preface it with a few remarks to set the scene, and then first of all deal with my own enlightenment experience in India. I'm not, by the way, claiming enlightenment or non-enlightenment. I'm going to describe an experience I had which I'd already in some sense prepared for, but in other ways hit me incredibly hard, and as I said, changed my approach to life. So I want to get that out of the way, because my own experience is not really what I want to talk about. I want to roam across a huge variety of different accounts of enlightenment. It seems to have a very varied description, so varied in fact, particularly across East and West, that people miss the commonalities in it, which are really quite simple. But at the same time, by having such a broad base of exemplars, examples and different languages, it's possible to home in, triangulate as it were, see from many different perspectives this same thing which is extremely elusive, which is not a thing, and you cannot journey towards because it's where you started from. In other words, it's filled with paradox, and even the most logical and rational expositors of it, for example the Buddha, are ultimately speaking in paradoxical terms. Perhaps the most important thing a teacher of enlightenment does, which I am not by the way, is communicate some energetic charge that opens you to what they're saying, even if what they're saying is paradoxical and incomprehensible, but which then appears to make sense to you. It is the language you then adopt, generally because you land up with a teacher and a tradition, and there's no particular reason to move outside of that teacher or the language of enlightenment that they've used, and therefore miss out. And in missing out, what happens is that many who seek enlightenment or even become enlightened, as the Buddha's chief disciples did, miss out on that personal expression of it, which makes it so much more intense and dynamic. We are all so unique that the way enlightenment takes us will be very, very different. And it is a shame if a conformity of language hides that. Okay, so the first part of the talk will be about my own experience. In the second part, I will introduce enlightenment more generally by looking at some common factors, looking at the wide variety of terms, trying to pin down some central possible characteristics of enlightenment, or perhaps better, how it hits people. What is the common factor the transformative factor. How are they changed by it? And taken together, this will be an introduction then to a long series of talks, fairly random, depending on what I dip into, possibly starting with Buddhism, as that has been a recent preoccupation, but it will depend rather on what I take down from the shelf and what fires me up on the day. Okay, to return to roughly 45 years ago, I was a young seeker who had stumbled into Hatha Yoga, or in the Iyengar school, and I was being trained in Oxford by a remarkable African teacher of the Indian art of Hatha Yoga in England. His name was Kofi Busia. He happened to be the son of the Ghanaian Prime Minister, and therefore possibly of royal descent. 2 or 3 lessons into the yoga classes, I was practicing it at home, my mother's home, family home, on the carpet in the living room. She was out, and they were sitting poses, or possibly I'd adopted something like a half lotus. And in that quiet and stillness, something much larger than myself impinged upon me and started to move my limbs, I guess my arms, as I was seated, in a manner a little bit akin to Tai Chi. I then investigated Tai Chi and found I couldn't enjoy the classes because I knew the movements from the inside, or my body knew them, or something had taught them to me spiritually. But going back to this moment on the carpet in the living room, these movements were accompanied by a blissful state. And here there's a parallel with the Buddha's life. It's only the memory of a blissful state when younger that redirects his inquiry, his search, his intense search from the dead end of asceticism that he'd been intent on for a long time, realizing that bodily energy is required for this movement into the enlightened state. It was a hunch, but he followed it and finally achieved what he was after. He couches it as a search for the end of suffering. This is a very specific and unique Northern Indian preoccupation that drives the search for enlightenment. I would say the vast bulk of people who become enlightened are not motivated by this specific issue. But that's for another day. My teacher, Kofi Busia, took our group out to India, I don't know how much later this was, to do an intensive Hatha Yoga course with Iyengar. Incidentally, Busia was a little disappointed that I didn't take him as his guru, and when I met Iyengar, I also knew that he was not the man to be my teacher either. I had read a couple of books by Rajneesh and had met somebody who was interested in him as a guru, as a teacher of enlightenment, and he lived in the same town, in Pune, in India, and my plan was to investigate, which I did, and I meditated, which was one branch of his joint technique, meditated quite intensively in his ashram, the other branch being an intensive program of group therapy. He thought Westerners, and perhaps by now everybody, needs this two-pronged approach to enlightenment, and it certainly worked for me. His talks were captivating, but there were elements in it that I couldn't accept, and I remember simply bracketing them out or putting them on hold for later examination. And the main issue there was reincarnation, which he assumed his audience would be comfortable with. He spoke alternate months, I think, in Hindi and then English, and there was a very large Indian audience always there. for a Westerner, reincarnation was difficult, but it didn't get in the way. I then fell ill with dengue fever and was confined to bed for 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. It hit me really hard. And in that period, I happened to have one of his books describing the 108 meditations of Shiva. So these were 108 different meditation techniques, and I simply worked through them. I don't know how far I got, but I had nothing else to do all day long. I liked that vitality, but nevertheless, it was still an intense experience of meditation, you could say, in the context of a teacher who was energetically highly charged. After 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever it was, my physical strength returned. The immune system had fought its battle and won, and ordinary vitality returned, and I felt well enough to get up and go outside into the courtyard of the, what's it called, hostel, belonging to the ashram. And I remember sitting on a mound of sand and watching a dog, and we were sort of briefly companions in the late afternoon, evening sun. And bang! I didn't know this was so charged to me. How odd. What happened was that thought stopped. It stopped for 6 hours. This is an incredibly long time. As I've proved to myself again and again in the intervening 45 years, I've never had such a period. The metaphor I like to use to describe this experience is, imagine you've lived all your life next to the Niagara Falls, and the roar of it, the deafening roar, is so familiar that you don't hear it. You blocked it out. You're simply unaware of it. A slightly better metaphor, actually thinking about it, would be industrial machinery. Because the point about this roaring, if it's man-made, is that it stresses the organism. I think a waterfall, being natural, may not. But anyway, imagine that it's a roaring noise that stresses the organism, and you built up your defences, you don't notice it, you carry on with your life. And then suddenly the tap is turned off, as it were. The torrent ceases instantly. What remains in the silence is perhaps a drip. 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 Thought doesn't completely cease, but it might as well have, and accompanying it was a sense of incredible bliss. Not that different to what I experienced on the carpet in the living room. And I looked at the dog, I looked at the sunset, I got up and wandered into town. I just felt like wandering around, no thoughts. Perfectly capable of negotiating the streets. A destination might occur. So, perfectly competent, but without thought, and full of this bliss. And then one of two thoughts that did emerge in that 6-hour period emerged after a while. I was young. I was new to this whole thing. India was incredibly disturbing in many ways. I'd been through 10 days intensive hatha yoga, unbelievably hard with Iyengar as taskmaster, then exposed to the lectures of Rajneesh, the meditations and the therapy. And this thought emerged, which is quite natural for somebody who's, in their 20s. I wanted validation. I wanted Rajneesh to tell me, yeah, this is what he's been talking about. And I remembered that he liked to have his evening meal occasionally in the restaurant of the Blue Diamond Hotel in Pune. And so a volition formed in me to go there, and as I've said, the competence remained, even though there was no thinking. The competence remained to get me there, to find a table, order a meal, and observe that Rajneesh wasn't there and wasn't going to be there. And so I must have spent an hour or so there. And then the second of these two thoughts began to emerge, and it was a fear that I would never be able to think normally again. I don't really know why I should have been afraid, because I wasn't disabled in any way by this. On the contrary, it was absolutely wonderful. But I made my way back to the hostel, to my bed. I was probably exhausted by then. Went to sleep, and in the morning the mind was back with the usual chatter that hasn't really stopped since then. It's quietened in meditation, and occasional moments I recapture it. So I think it's reasonable to describe that as an enlightenment experience, and one can use technical terms from Hinduism or Buddhism, samadhi, the fourth jhana, whatever. I'm not sure that all these terms in their variety don't actually all describe the same thing, but it doesn't matter. The experience set me on a course of exploration. Rajneesh was a very good starting ground because he was very eclectic. He would speak about many teachers, and I suppose I already had that instinct, which is why I wanted to go to his ashram. And I extended his explorations vastly more than he did in his own lifetime. And also, I became a trained scholar, which means that I can read, and still do, vast tracts, religious works from the dawn of time to now, transcripts of very long talks or retreats, books. I eat them, and this means that I have a very big data set to draw on. I don't know, maybe 100 examples. I've never counted them. They're all there, and they've all added something to this composite picture of enlightenment, which is what I will be exploring with you over the coming talks. Okay, I really hope that that's enough about me. I may introduce other elements now and again to make a point. I want to get me out of the way because actually I do have my own teachings, and I may much later in this course of lectures introduce them. They have, if you like, been drawn from this vast mass of material. But I want to present the material in its individuality first. So probably the first teacher I will turn to is the Buddha, as I happen to be reading a lot of the original scriptures, and then maybe Taoism, and I'll see. It'll be a random journey, but it'll land up being highly comprehensive, and many points will have to be revisited from different angles as we travel. I hope you'll join me in this journey. Okay, so what remains in this talk, crucially, is to give some broad initial definition of enlightenment, a working hypothesis or a working set of ideas that make sense of the big variety of teachers and traditions I'll be talking about. it's not easy, it's maybe impossible, to boil enlightenment down to a few words, because any words are going to miss the point. But I have gradually honed in on something very simple that will act as a peg to hang everything else on, a placeholder if you like. And I've chosen it because it's not a very popular one. And I know it's not popular because whenever I raise it anywhere, it's not met with much joy. And this will be my approach. I would rather tackle head-on enlightenment in its most difficult aspect than creep up on it using sugary, fancy, enticing phrases and promises and fantasies. Because if enlightenment means anything, if the journey into enlightenment means anything, it is a journey into the real. And the real is what humanity is always travelling away from at rocket speed. So the teacher of enlightenment grabs you with a hook around the neck as you flee reality and says, stop, point in the other direction. I know it doesn't look very nice initially, but if you have any appetite for the real, stop here and start travelling towards it. Start abandoning the fantasies. So anyhow, I'll tell a little story of a man who found this particular definition. I haven't come to it yet. It's quite a long preamble, I suppose. A man who found this idea disagreeable, and it was a teacher, a holy man, a recluse, we're not exactly sure how to categorize him, at the time of the Buddha, who had a large following, and had heard that the Buddha, it must have been in fairly early stages, was developing a large following, and so he asks one of the Buddha's monks, what does your master teach? And so this monk told him in a few words, summed up the Buddha's teaching. It is a summary that I will come to, and in perhaps the next talk go into in great detail the Buddha's exposition of it. So the monk gives this summary, and the let's call him holy man reacts against it. He says, this is a most disagreeable teaching. This is a pernicious view. I will, if I have the chance to meet Master Gautama, I will correct him on this. I will defeat him on this. I will pummel him into the ground on this. I can't remember the exact imagery, but they're all imageries of bare-knuckle fighting, and the victory over this Master Gautama will be plain to see, he says, because there will be sweat pouring from his armpits in defeat. Okay, very colourful. And this is part of the joy of reading the ancient texts in the Pali Canon, by the way. So this holy man gets the chance for debate with the Buddha, and there is a protocol and a great deal of politeness, but the Buddha has heard of the man's boast. And the Buddha is a very patient man, very kindly man, but if somebody comes full of arrogance and rudeness, he's going to be on their case. So, very politely, the two debated, and slowly but surely this holy man is defeated. And he becomes the very picture of what he thought the Buddha would look like. Miserable, silent, cowed, defeated. And you would think actually that was enough for the Buddha, but he likes to press his point home because this man's followers are there. So here's a large group of people who've witnessed this, and the Buddha's final little flourish is to take off his robe, his top, and show his body entirely dry, not a drop of sweat anywhere. I think it's a lovely little glimpse into the man's character. But the point, this was a long detour. These stories are worth telling, I think. The point is that the monk summed up the Buddha's teaching, as the Buddha would, and does on many occasions, as a teaching of no self. The entire abandonment of self in all aspects of experience of sentience. The Buddha neatly divides the experience of sentient beings into 5 categories, and within them he goes into great detail how I, me and mine are absent from every corner of them. So what the man was finding disagreeable was the teaching of no self, and I think I prefer to start there than anywhere else. It is an extremely challenging idea, and of course those 2 words are merely a placeholder. It is a far more subtle thing than might be suggested, and yet it's a pretty good summary, I think, of what teachers of enlightenment everywhere through history have stumbled into for themselves and then taught their pupils: no self. Now, just to finish, I've used the word enlightenment all the way through, from the beginning, and these talks are explorations of enlightenment. But we have many other terms, and they're important to flag up. It's fashionable now in Buddhist circles not to use the word enlightenment, but awakening. Fine. Awakening. Liberation is a word used widely by the Buddha himself. That's very good. Politicized Western consciousness immediately assumes that it is economic or political liberation. Of course, it's nothing to do with that. It's, well, again, putting it bluntly, liberation from the false understanding of self, you could say. But more than that. So liberation, enlightenment, awakening. There's an Indian word, moksha, that is used. The Indians also use the term self-realization, which seems to fly against no self, but it is also a very good term. Realization, to make real. You make yourself real instead of the fantastical version that one grows up with. All of which we'll explore. Other people have used different terms. In the West, we don't really have a tradition of enlightenment. But the nearest comparable term would be mystical union with God, holy union. And then late in the 19th century, a man called Richard Morris Buck came up with the term cosmic consciousness. That's also good, quite like that. But really it doesn't matter. I think these will all do. You can also use a range of terms to characterize enlightenment. Instead of finding a term for it, you can use a characteristic. So it can be called the stainless, the spotless, the imperishable, the eternal, the infinite. These kind of characteristics abound. And they will, when you add up this pile of terms, I think you get the territory we're in. Very good. That'll do for today. I hope this is enough to whet your appetite, give you a clear idea of where the remaining talks, unknown number of talks to come, will go, and that you'll join me in this journey of discovery. Thank you.